I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Our topic today is the urgent question of how to decrease the excess CO2 in the atmosphere as global warming advances, and more specifically, whether the technology called carbon capture and sequestration is actually a viable solution, especially compared to biological sequestration. Our guests, June Sequeira, Senior Research Fellow at the New School, Geneva Goodwin, Co-Director of Global Development and Environment Institute, Tufts University, will explain this issue and the options. Thank you both for joining us. And I'd like to start by getting the audience acquainted, I hope, with your very fine article, which will show up on the screen in the online magazine called The Conversation about a year ago in 1921. And I urge people to look at this. It's been an excellent resource. It's hard to come by any article for the general public that gets a lot of the information in. And then we move to the issue of the fossil industry. For decades, they have managed to stall the issue of climate change in general, certainly, and the problem of getting the CO2 out. Could you give us a little background on how that has worked?
Well, I'll give you a very brief comment about the history, which is that back in the 1970s, ExxonMobil had a lot of really good scientists working on understanding climate change. And for example, they changed their investment strategy because of what they knew. So that when they were planning a oil rig in the ocean, they put it several feet higher than it would have been necessary because they were anticipating sea level rise. So there was a lot of very firm knowledge, and then they realized that if this knowledge got out into the world, people would make changes in how we manage our energy policy and our energy habits. So fast forward to the present, they were very, very effective in throwing doubt through published statements and through lobbying of people in government. So we come up to the COP26 in Glasgow last October, where the final statement was issued agreeing that coal should be phased out, but making no mention of oil and gas. There was massive lobbying, over 100 people representing oil firms there, more than any of the largest country representations. And now what's happening is the amounts of money being involved, not only money that goes in various ways to politicians and governments, but there's money going into huge investments. The dozen biggest oil companies together are on track to spend a total of over $103 million every day for the rest of this decade, exploiting new fields of oil and gas that cannot be burned if global warming is to be limited as it should be. These investments can only pay off if countries don't rapidly slash carbon emissions. But if they don't pay off, if the investments turn out to be no good, it's shareholders, pension funds, and public finances that will be very much hurt by this. So it's a horrible bet on which way we go and who gets hurt and how soon. And the governments have been very leery, major governments, the US very much among them, of calling a halt to these investments, which are really one of the most dangerous things happening on the planet today.
That's right. Right. And not only that, but they're actually increasing this. We now have an office in the Department of Energy just for this. So
Yeah.
it's extremely frustrating for the public in general, even if you are knowledgeable about the problem. And so we should go on to first of all, they've managed to stall for a very long time, and that they're getting huge amounts of money from the governments, especially this government, and they are able to lobby very successfully. Okay, so the idea now is don't worry about a thing. We're going to capture this carbon. So we have this urgent need to extract this carbon, excess carbon that is heating up the globe. And this is one of the technical innovations that's supposed to be so helpful. And so we're going to turn then to June Sequeira to ask her about the carbon capture and sequestration issue there. What is that and what's going on?
So to refer to the history that Neva was just talking about, what's happened is that there's been a change of strategy. The fossil fuel industry has sort of pivoted from denying causes to fabricating and controlling solutions. So for years they denied the causes, but as recently as last October, at a congressional hearing, the CEOs of fossil fuel companies said, "Oh, we recognize that our fuels are that our emissions are causing climate change, and what we're offering now is a lower carbon fuel."
Right.
And so what they have done is there's sort of two main things going on. One is that there's this control of solutions, really, by fabricating solutions that don't work, and I can get into the don't work part. The chief ones being carbon capture and storage. There's really two kinds of, and we call it mechanical carbon capture and storage, to differentiate that method of removing carbon from biological systems like trees and grasslands restoration,
Right.
that sort of thing. So sticking right now to the mechanical methods,
Yes.
there's really two ways of doing it. One is to capture the CO2 as it comes out of smokestacks, called source capture. And the other way is to pull the CO2 out of the air. Both are industrial processes using chemicals and machinery to do either of those processes.
What are some of the problems with CCS, with carbon capture? We say sequestration, storage, whichever, but there are mechanical problems with that, of like scale and so on. And then the other is the enormous expense, whether this is effective or not, if you would, please.
Yeah. So the main problem with these mechanical methods of carbon capture and storage is that they don't work.
There you
And
are.
what do I mean by that? So let's define work. So work means that they're going to deliver, as we've been led to believe, that these methods will reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Because the problem is we've got a big buildup of excess CO2 in the atmosphere that's causing the
Right.
climate change that the impacts we're seeing. So if that's the need, then do these methods actually reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? So let's look at source capture. Let's look at pulling CO2 when it comes out of smokestacks. That doesn't take any CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Right.
The best it can do is to perhaps capture new CO2 emissions, which it doesn't even do a good job at.
Right.
There's plenty of evidence that it's not even really doing that. The other method is to pull CO2 out of the air through these industrial chemical means. That doesn't work in a couple of senses. One is that the main system for DAC, direct air capture, uses fossil fuels to power the system. Right. Methane, natural gas, and that's that's the method that can most easily be scaled up. Studies have shown that if you use fossil fuels to power the DAC system, you're putting more CO2 into the air than you're taking out.
Thank you.
And then you come to the reality that the captured carbon in the biggest DAC plant to be built in the United States will be used for new oil extraction.
Right.
And this is a plant that's to be built by Occidental Petroleum in concert with Carbon Engineering, a DAC firm, to be built in Texas. Right now, the carbon capture and storage at sources, at smokestacks, uses all of the captured, there's a dozen projects right now. In all but one of them, the captured CO2 is being used for new oil extraction. And in the DAC plant in Texas, the captured CO2 will be used for new oil extraction. It's called enhanced oil recovery, EOR. All of this carbon capture, the CCS, the DAC, all of this mechanical stuff that is going on right now, these projects that are going on, are enabled by the U.S. taxpayer.
That's right.
None of it would be happening if the subsidies weren't there. There's a tax credit called the 45Q tax credit, and there are direct subsidies. There is not any significant amount of private investment, so none of this would be happening without the federal subsidies, which are we're up to about $24 billion in the last 20, 30 years as of now.
Right. Now, there are a couple of other things I want to underscore. As you've pointed out, it hasn't worked. These things don't scale up, and when they are extracting, they extract some minimal amount, and it takes more energy to do the extracting, right, than it does to actually capture the CO2. Now, let's just assume for a moment that you capture some CO2. Then the other part of that is it has to be stored somewhere, and that's an issue as well, correct? About the transport,
That's right.
the actual putting it in the ground. What's the storage issue, if you will?
Yeah, and the storage is a huge issue with storage, but just to also underscore that to get to the storage is going to take,
Right.
as one study out of Princeton showed, tens of thousands of miles of pipelines.
Right, that people don't
Talking
want.
pipelines, new pipelines, because
Right.
the existing pipelines that pipe oil and gas can't be used for CO2 because the CO2 is under high pressure, and there's
Right.
all sorts of technical reasons you can't just reuse, you cannot safely reuse existing pipelines. And pipelines rupture and have ruptured.
Right.
And when CO2 ruptures out of a pipeline, it can kill or cause illness among people and animals, and has.
Right.
So you pipe it with all these dangers, especially for frontline communities through which, in the poor communities through which these pipelines will run, and then the areas where it'll be stored. So you have to inject the CO2 underground under very high pressure,
Right.
which also can cause, it's sort of like, I like to call it, it's basically a form of carbonized fracking.
Yes.
So you have to think of it as injecting CO2 underground under extremely high pressure. And there's dangers of blowouts, which can occur. There's dangers of, once you inject it underground, of earthquakes, they're called seismic events. Those earthquakes can rupture the strata underground and cause the CO2 that's stored under very high pressure to migrate, and then to migrate into underground water sources. Right. And cause water contamination. And there's a whole litany, which I won't go into unless you'd like me to, the ills that can happen from this underground, highly pressurized underground storage of CO2. I have to say that there are other ways of doing underground storage, but they are, which you know, there will be rebuttals to what I'm saying. But that those other methods are so underdeveloped as to not be significant in a climate relevant time scale.
Right. And we
I
want
also would like to say that there are other methods of doing direct air capture that are so minuscule that that the likelihood of their being scaled up to a meaningful scale in a relevant time scale is essentially, not going to happen.
Right. And at the moment, we just want to get this general picture so that people can comprehend what's going on here. First, that what the industry has been doing, to block movement away from the fossil fuels and to renewables. And the second here, now we're going to come up with this high-tech approach to extracting this excess CO2. And I should point out that CO2 is extremely dangerous. It's going to be in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. It's a really serious problem in global warming. We're going to extract this in miraculous ways, but it hasn't worked at all yet, despite the investment of gazillions of dollars. And the other part of that is, as you pointed out, the storage issue is a monumental issue. There will be massive problems, guaranteed. So that, I hope we get that across. And a lot of this is covered, incidentally, in your very fine article. Okay, we don't really apparently need this. And I'm back to you then, Dr. Goodwin, if you would explain to us the virtues of just the biological sequestration.
So let me start by saying that humanity over the last 100 or more years, actually quite a lot more, has been creating a deficit in what the biological system, the ecology of the Earth can do. Mm-hmm. The Earth has a capacity to store and hold an enormous amount of CO2, and before humans began messing it up, there was an enormous amount stored in trees, in soil, in the ocean. Soil holds a lot more than the things above it, and that's important to remember. The ocean is extremely important. So there's some good news here. Because we've created this deficit, we have an account we can fill. Mm-hmm. And so if we were to change how we do agriculture and forestry and urban forestry and wetlands management, and very importantly, grazing land management, yes. Grasslands are a very big piece of the picture. And all of these are currently doing much less than they could. Mm-hmm. They're doing a lot. In fact, in the United States, we emit about 5 gigatons of CO2 per year through our activities, and about 1 gigaton is already being captured and stored by natural systems. We could double that quite easily.
You mean if we change our habits?
If we act differently.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
The biological sequestration methods, there are many different kinds. People trying to come up with the price for it is very, very complicated. But to boil it down into a single number, it's about 1/10 as much yes. as any known or proven mechanical method. So it's a much better investment. And the other point about that investment is, first of all, it can start right away. Mm-hmm. You can change your agricultural practices very fast. Planting trees, okay, the new trees take longer, but you can stop cutting down the old ones, which is a very important piece of it. Grazing land management systems can be changed quite rapidly. So a lot can happen very fast. And the capacity to refill this deficit that we've created is certainly there for several decades. And in the end of several decades, it's going to slow down gradually because the reservoirs will have been somewhat more filled, but it's got a long way to go. We can go to the end of this century and keep removing CO2 from the air. And the beauty of the natural systems is that the very system that removes it stores it. Mm-hmm. So the trees, the plants are pulling it out of the atmosphere and immediately putting it into their roots and into the soil. And then, of course, the other point is that as you do this, you're not creating problems. You're creating all sorts of other solutions at the same time. You're reducing air pollution, reducing fire risk, creating flood control and drought mitigation, water conservation, reducing soil erosion, and improving soil fertility, which has a very important impact on the quality of food we eat and the nutritional value. You're conserving energy because all these ways of doing things better as we care for the earth are using less energy. You're reducing coastal land erosion and urban heat. And then there's a whole lot of very well documented physical and mental health effects that come from beginning to undo the harm.
Right. I'd like to underscore a couple of things in here. First of all, by comparison with the carbon capture method there and sequestration, the highly mechanical with lots of risk and hasn't worked and it's very expensive. This is much cheaper and immediate. We don't have to wait for it to scale up. But there are several things. We have to drop fossil fuels, right?
Of course.
And we can do it. We have the resources. We can move on to renewables. So that's one thing. You've brought out a couple of interesting things. I think it is known, a lot of people know that there's been a lot of damage to the soil, which we're counting on to capture. There's been a lot of damage to the oceans, which are warming up. We can sort of rectify this if we hurry up, but you brought up the agriculture, which is a big contributor to the CO2 problem. What is the answer to that agriculture problem, please?
Well,
no-till.
They're pretty well known. No-till, cover crops,
Yes.
crop rotation, going as much as possible towards perennials wherever you can. There's a lot of talk about perennial wheat. I think that's still
Yes.
quite far in the future, but there are other perennials. Go for deeper rooted crops. All of this is kind of fine-tuned stuff. If you're not into agriculture, it sounds a little odd and you wonder, could this be real? But it is. And farmers, people involved in agriculture, are thinking about these things all the time, except if they're into some huge monoculture where you have one type of corn, you grow it in one way, you use pesticides and herbicides, which are killing the biota in the soil.
And destroying the soil, yeah.
Exactly. When the soil is dead, when it's been drenched with pesticides and herbicides, it's no longer got the capacity to store because there's all this living stuff under our feet, and they are great storage reservoirs. We have to rebuild that. But it can be done quite quickly.
Right. The other thing, it's curious, the industrialization of everything. You know, industrialization of agriculture, of fishing is another one's destroying the seas.
That's right.
So this has been an enormous problem all along. And then we come up with an industrialization solution of carbon capture. It's always got to be that way. And that's coming from one direction. And those people are able to get a great deal of funding. So I would like to just make sure that from you that this natural approach is doable. It is not going to harm whole communities the way the CCS will, with the leakage and toxins and so on. And it will correct some of the procedures we have imposed that have destroyed so much of the planet, as in the agriculture and so on, because you'll bring back a healthier mode altogether.
And you know, people are suffering a great deal of trauma from recognition of the harm we've done to the earth.
Yes.
And some of that can be reversed, and we can all be involved. And so there's this huge psychological benefit.
That is an excellent point.
From knowing that we can undo some of the harm we've done.
That's right. Everything about that makes sense. Then it's a question of how do you get the government to sort of fund this at a fraction of the cost. And also, that's a really good point, that everybody can get involved, communities.
That's right.
Everybody can get involved to heal the planet, where right now people feel helpless.
And then, of course, the question of how you get government involved. Here's the problem, that the big actors with a lot of money are pulling in one direction.
Yes.
And they're pulling towards the mega solutions. And the things that will help people all over, they don't have the same kind of huge financial resources and centralization to get the government to change.
Right, but this is, so we want to deliver the message, there really is hope if you can make this transition, and then articles like yours that put out there the facts of how damaging this is and how much it is costing the taxpayer in the end without their permission or knowledge most of the time. That is really an important thing. So we want to push this biological sequestration. I do hope you will continue writing, both of you, get out there to the public on this, because this is really much more viable, and it's really the only solution possible, I think. You both, in closing, we only have a minute left here, but you are not coming directly from climate science. Tell me a little bit, briefly, you have this extensive background, both of you, but let me start with you then.
Well, I'm an economist, and I also have just a lifetime of devotion to environmental issues. So I haven't been professionally an environmentalist, but I've been an economist and come into it that way.
And the organization at Tufts that is very well known for this kind of thing. Very, very progressive.
Well,
very
thank
progressive. You. And thank you for your work. And then if I can ask you, June, about your background. Both of you go on for pages and pages with background.
Yeah, I'm a public policy person. I worked in government for quite a long time, and then moved into the academic world and mainly focusing on economics, and researched and wrote a lot about the public economy, wrote a book on the public economy, which is I met Neva through the economics work. But then also, because of that work, got into biophysical economics, and then looking at the biophysics of carbon capture and as a public policy issue. So the work that I've done on carbon capture has been something that really nobody else has done, because we've been looking at it from the perspective of public need and public good, and combining that with biophysical realities. And so the legislators and policymakers really haven't looked at it as a question from the biophysical perspective or even the public need perspective. So that's what I've been doing.
Right. You've contributed just so much, and I thank you a lot for that.
Yvonne, I'd like to add that if your viewers would like to get better informed about carbon capture and understand some of the mythology that they're hearing with the ads from the fossil fuel industry, that there is a brand new website that's just been put up. It's called carboncapturefacts.org. And it was organized by a number of organizations working on this issue and attempting to get the facts out, led by the Science and Environmental Health Network.
Thank you very much for that information. We'll definitely put it up, and I'll put it on your event page and so on too. But we'll be very happy to push out all these possible sources. That's the other thing. You're competing with so much false information these days. It's I ask you, please, on behalf of the public, keep writing, okay? And make appearances, but we need people like you that are comprehensive. You know, a lot of science is very narrow, but you are able to look at it across both the science and the economics and the public policy. This is much more comprehensive worldview, if you will, and it's much appreciated. Please keep working, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you.
Good luck.